Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our 10th annual GWPF lecture, which this year coincides with the 10th anniversary of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, believe it or not. 10 years ago, almost to the day, in the run-up to the bungled Copenhagen Climate Conference, Lord Lawson and a group of like-minded peers and MPs launched the Global Warming Policy Foundation in the House of Lords. And you may remember that 4 days earlier, on the 19th of November 2009, another momentous event unfolded when a large number of emails and files from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia was dumped on the internet, a seismic event in the history of science that triggered the so-called ClimateGate scandal. Professor Kelly, our speaker tonight, was Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department for Communities and Local Government and became a member of the independent assessment panel that was set up to investigate the ClimateGate issue. However, he was the only one on the panel who warned his fellow panelists that any whitewash by the inquiry would ultimately undermine the credibility of the scientific establishment, a very tragic development we've seen over the last 10 years. In light of manifest evidence in the ClimateGate emails of climate researchers trying to suppress critical voices of fellow scientists, Professor Kelly warned at the time, and I quote, "I think it's easy to see how peer review within a tight network can allow new orthodoxies to appear and get established." Regrettably, none of his concerns were mentioned or included in the final report of the inquiry. I should mention finally another important milestone in Professor Kelly's contribution to our debate. You may recall that there was a rebellion of 43 fellows of the Royal Society in 2010, and he was one of the rebels who hoped to persuade the society to rethink its rather dogmatic position on climate change. And Professor Kelly and his colleagues actually succeeded in revising the Royal Society's position in that the uncertainty of climate modeling was finally admitted. Since then, however, the Society has, and much of the scientific establishment, I'm afraid, have become more rather than less dogmatic on these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, the UK Parliament earlier this year rushed through a net zero emissions target for 2050, despite warnings that this will cost the country more than £1 trillion. At the same time, energy cost revolts in many parts of the world signal a backlash against regressive climate energy policies. These protests are happening as families are increasingly concerned about the rising cost of energy taxes and other levies, which invariably hit the poor and those just managing hardest. It is these social costs and technological hurdles that tonight's lecture will focus upon. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Kelly.
Thank you. It's a singular honour to be asked to deliver this annual lecture of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and I'm pleased that so many of you have been able to come tonight. I would hope to be able to inform, educate and entertain you in the way that the BBC wouldn't on certain aspects of what I'm going to say tonight. I make no apologies for the stream of hard data that I will put before you as I make my argument. And I also appeal straight away that if you see any proven error of fact anywhere in anything I say, please inform me immediately. I have no interest in promulgating half-truths or falsehoods, which characterize so much of the debate these days. Now, my interest in this topic tonight was aroused during the period 2006 to 9, when I was part-time the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Communities and Local Government, whose responsibilities include building standards and planning. When the Climate Change Act of 2008 was signed, I pointed out to ministers that 45% of the CO2 emissions from the UK come from heating air and water in buildings, 27% from homes and 18% from all others. I persuaded Lord Drayson, as the then Science Minister, to undertake a pilot programme where over 100 social houses were retrofitted in order to reduce their emissions. I'll say something about the results of that investigation in a later slide. On my return to Cambridge, I was asked by my engineering colleagues to lead the teaching of final year undergraduates and graduate engineers on present and future energy systems at the national level. And I did this until I retired in 2016. The introductory lecture of that course was on the scale of any future energy transition that we might consider, and is the forerunner for the first half of this lecture. I make this point at this point because I quite often get cavilling critics saying, what is an electronic engineer addressing these matters for? Now, I want to begin tonight, this one, I have to be two-handed here. I want to start, given that there's a climate of gloom, I want to start with an upside. We've got enough energy around at the moment. Nobody's complaining of dearth of energy. And here is what's happened in relative terms. The percentage change of hunger, child mortality, illiteracy, poverty, all the things that we worry about are getting better, and substantially better. We can plot those down and say that we'll be rid of most of them by 2040 or 2050, which is an interesting comment. That's on an absolute scale. Here are the deaths from various forms of energy production: brown coal, oil, biomass, gas, and nuclear. And you can see the trend, at least, is towards systems. Now, I don't have anything for the current renewables, and that's a gap because there isn't much data yet. But if anybody knows of it, I'd be willing to receive and keen to receive it. And then the other thing I want to show here during the 20th century is the deaths from natural disasters. And they're all here, but unfortunately the only thing that's missing from this slide is the, it's that one there, yeah, is this tsunami business here, 2 tsunamis which should have added to that. But you can see there that there's been a constant downward trend, and the reason for that is that we have 3 days' notice of most of these things now, and nearly all the preparation is available for people to get out of the way. Right, here's the structure of the talk tonight. The first half is about the scale of any energy transition we might consider. And I'm going to talk about, I've got an introduction, then I'm going to talk about the energy sector and the contemporary drivers. And I have 2 slides in section 3, which I think encapsulate the main point that I want to make. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk about some more matters of engineering details, which seem not to get the coverage that I think they deserve in the public debate. I want to start with a parable, a couple of parables, really. I'm going to ask a simple practical question. Suppose I agree with you to that you'll dig me a hole 2 meters deep because I want to bury some family treasure. And I agree that I'll pay you £200 when you finish the job. And so you get out there, start digging, but halfway through your digging, you suddenly see a long line of people with wheelbarrows full of earth coming along, ready to fill your hole in every half hour. So here are you trying to dig a hole to get 100 or 200 quid, and there's a whole lot. Would you carry on digging? It's a simple, practical question. Who would carry on digging? Fine. I'm glad. Most people would stop and say, what's going on? And so when you say, look, I'm being paid £100 or £200 to dig this hole, and they say, we're all being paid £500 each if we fill in a hole. Well, the reason I make this is that there's an analogy here, because in New Zealand and in this country, and I hold passports for both, we're busy trying to close down the last coal-fired power stations in this country in the name of climate change mitigation. But the largest civil engineering project in the world at the moment is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Now, in the last 20 years, the Chinese have taken 600 million people out of grinding poverty into middle-class existence. They live in houses with running water and electricity. The Belt and Road Project is going to do the same thing for 2 billion people in West Asia and down into Africa. That's going to come with 700 new coal-fired power stations, nearly 300 of which are being built as we speak. So you see my analogy of the utter futility in real terms of much of what is being done. Now, I had a discussion with my wife and friends at lunchtime, and I just got criticised, but this is an excuse for doing nothing. But I don't see any point doing anything which is futile. Now, I also want to remind you of the Tower of Babel, which has some lessons for engineering. When the generation in the Old Testament said they were going to build a tower to heaven, there were two features of that project as an engineering project. One was that they didn't have a way of knowing when they could declare success because they actually had reached heaven. And secondly, they didn't know how much it was going to cost when they set out to do this. Now, I would claim the same for climate change mitigation. How do we define that we have actually stopped climate change? And how much will it cost? Now, these are fundamental things which I think are important. Now, I want to contrast. I'm not going to talk about the science tonight. I'll come back just for a minute on it. But I want to just remind you of the four characteristics of anything to do with engineering: honesty and integrity, respect for life, law, the environment, and public good, accuracy and rigor, and leadership and communications. Now, as a scientist, I don't have to sign up to any of those. As an engineer, if I sign off something as fit for purpose, I'm legally liable. But if I sign off this is an experiment or a claim that there's far fewer polar bears around than ever, there's no comeback on me if it turns out to be wrong. But as engineers, it is. Now, I want to just finish this introduction of introductions by referring to three American presidents. Some of you may know this, but Eisenhower in 1961 basically said the following: "Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite." I would say that's where we are today. Only the next year in Houston, President Kennedy made the immortal phrase, "We choose to go to the moon." Now, at the time when he chose to go to the moon, his scientific and technological advisors would have pointed out to him that there was no unknown in the more modern jargon, that all that it needed was resource and willpower and the dedicated effort of a small and dedicated crew of engineers. And they went to the moon. But only shortly after getting to the moon, President Nixon, in his 1971 State of the Nation address, said, "I will also ask for the appropriation of an extra $100 million to launch an intensive campaign to find a cure for cancer, and I will ask later for whatever additional funds can effectively be used. The time has come in America when the same kind of concentrated effort that split the atom and took man to the moon should be turned towards conquering this dread disease." Now, I don't mind that as a wish, but there would have been no medical advisors telling him this is around the corner, because we know 50 years later that we have made quite a lot of progress, but it's not a solved problem. So I would claim that our attempts to, in engineering terms, to solve the climate change problem has more akin to the cancer problem than going to the moon. And yet it's only last week that over 1,000 of my academic colleagues signed letters to everybody saying we've got to be given extended leave so we can solve the planet, save the planet in the same way that we went to the moon. Now, I regard that as fundamentally flawed. Right. So now the energy sector. I want to talk about it as a whole and then make some remarks on renewables. This is a graph which I find rather interesting. It starts with 1800 marked as 1, and it shows three things. The brown one, going from 1 to 7.58, is the population in billions of the Earth. The green line is the primary energy that's been used, the growth of primary energy, and you can see that we actually use about 8 times as more energy per person than we do back in 1800. And then there's the GDP that's taking off, so that we're doing more and more in the world with the energy that we're using in terms of what we're delivering. So the size, the fraction of our world economy that's devoted to energy is decreasing. And here's some hard data from Sweden from 1800 to the year 2000, showing that 50% of the economy in Sweden in 1800 was devoted to providing energy, right down now to 10% now. And the UK data is very similar, but I haven't seen it plotted in a nice, crisp graph like that. Interestingly, if you go back to 1800 and look, about half the people in the world, in the UK, work to provide food and fuel for the rest of the economy. So half of the economy, roughly, was on providing fuel. And so it's a similar form there. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, we started using fossil fuels. And so this is a graph now from 1800, historical, the fraction of the share of global energy that comes from renewables. So in 1800, it was 90%. That was mainly trees in various forms. But fossil fuels came in just before that. And then this is the consequent rise. So we've come all the way down here to just over 10% of the world's energy is provided with renewable energy. And a lot of that is, by the way, along that bottom there, a lot of that's hydro. And then you see at the bottom the two upticks, one with the current policies and one if there's 100% delivery of the Paris Agreement. Now, of course, the target that everybody wants to get to is somewhere up here. That's, this is climate extinction, Extinction Rebellion, and indeed the IPCC targets. This is where we're at today. Or actually, it might be, I think it's 2017 data. And what you see is that 80% of the world's energy is provided by fossil fuels. And then there's a little bit of nuclear. Traditional biomass, there's still a lot of people going down, cutting down trees and burning scrub to cook. Modern renewables are this 10% here. This 10% here, of which is made up of renewable heat, hydro, even there, liquid biofuels, and renewable power. And that's the one that everybody focuses on. That is what fraction of our electricity comes from renewables. But the important thing is that that's that 80% that's there. And I think I have another slide in here, which comes later, to show that that 80% hasn't moved for the last 40 years. Now, this graph I find really interesting because it summarizes the problem we have in front of us. The black line going up there are the carbon dioxide emissions in gigatons. And notice there, it's interesting, it's a flick over 2 years ago, but last year it went up another 3%, so it is going up inexorably. There's been a number of model calculations to keep the temperature of the world down to 1.5 degrees, the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and their need is for the carbon emissions to do that. So what we need is not one, but a herd of unicorns to deliver that, because what we have to do by the time we get to the 2100 is we're going to be way back. The amount of energy that we're going to be able to use per person that is fossil fuel-based is the same as we used per person in this country in 1880. Every other bit of energy we use has got to come from clean sources. And while there's such a current moratorium on new nuclear, it's a fraught exercise. But I claim that we're not going to get that by any known form of engineering project that would command democratic support. Clearly, if we decided that it was World War III, things might happen. But, and of course, Extinction Rebellion want that curve to drop in the next 6 years. And I would claim the only way to do that is to unleash a nuclear war and kill off 90% of the population, and we might get there. But I can't see any other alternative of practical engineering. Right. I want the next 2 or 3 slides, I think, encapsulate the heart of what I want to say. It's a discussion of the contemporary drivers of our energy needs. This is data from, this is a graph from BP, they're updated every 2 years, showing that billions of tons of oil equivalent of the total amount of energy we use in the world, from 1965 through to 2019, which is hard data, and then extrapolated out to 2035. And you can see coal at the bottom, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro, and the renewables growing up there. That's just been growing more rapidly. This is one of the more recent slides. It's been growing more rapidly than people predicted, and I'm quite happy to accept that. Now, I want to just ask you to look back from the period of, what do I want to do with my, oh, here it is. I want you to look at the period 1995 to 2015. That's a period from here. Why is that? From about here to about here. And in that period, the demand for energy in the world went up by 40%. And over that time, there's another slide which you have to correlate, which is this one. This is from the World Bank, dividing the world into poor, middle class, and rich. The rich is down the bottom. The green is the middle class. Now, their definition of middle class, we have to be very careful, is the fact that you live in a dwelling with running water and electricity. There's no mention of personal mobility or anything else, but that's their definition. And so what you see is a rise. So you've got this rise here and then a steeper rise up. This part here was the work of the Chinese developments of 600 million people. This is part of the Belt and Road project going up. And so what you see there is an increase in the middle class. Now, if I go back one to this slide here, and I'm going to make one assumption. If a person who's living in a middle class dwelling uses somewhere between 3 and 4 times as much energy per person per day, remember, in practice, they're in a high-rise building and they've got water and electricity. If I assume that they use between 3 and 4 times as much energy as a person who lives in an urban slum or a rural hovel, which doesn't have uniform access to electricity and others, I can fit that data quantitatively. Because in practice, and explain the whole of this curve from 2000 to 2035 simply by the meeting of the first and the second of the Sustainable Development Goals. The first and second of the Sustainable Development Goals are the elimination of world hunger and world poverty. And the sustainable climate is number 13. So as far as I'm concerned, these 2 slides encapsulate why the world is getting better. And it demands energy. So that as long as people living in a high-rise building in towns, and of course the Chinese Belt and Road project is going to do for the whole of Western Asia and the whole of Africa what it did for its own people in the last 20 years. Now, I don't have any particular truck or defense for the sort of neo-colonial aspects of the Belt and Road project, but in terms of meeting Sustainable Development Goals, this is the biggest civil engineering project to deliver those. And of course, it comes with 700 coal-fired power stations, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this is BP data where they've just moved it along a bit. It's the same data as we've had before, but drawn in different ways. And all I want to do is to show you that all of the work that we've got here on renewables going down the bottom are such that when we get to 2035, there, you can see the dot at the end there, the amount of energy we're going to get from renewables is half of each of oil, gas, or coal. In fact, if it was that alone, it would be 1/6, but only 1/10 of the global energy in 2035, based on the current kind of progress that we're doing, is going to come from renewables. And there's a study at MIT that says if we carry on at this pace, it will take 400 years. Because, let's be clear, every windmill and every solar panel is made with fossil fuels still. And we've got to even get as far enough as we make those without that. But the best estimate is that the current progress will take 400 years to wean ourselves off fossil fuels as we know it at this rate. And so if we are going to succeed, we're going to have to do something 10 times faster. And there's no political will anywhere to pay the opportunity costs implied. I'll come back to that topic when I get on to housing later on. So now what I want to do is talk about the progress in decarbonisation to date with reference to 3 countries, the UK, Germany and China. Just a few slides here. This, by the way, shows the fossil fuel share of total energy demand for the last 40-something years. And you can see it all sits at 81 plus or minus 2%. So all of the effort in renewables is to increase renewables, by the way, at the decrease of nuclear, so those two balance out. The rest of it has just been got with fossil fuels growing at 7 times the rate of the renewables. Here's the UK situation, and you can see the carbon emissions have been coming down. The green, by the way, represents the period of the Climate Change Act. So a lot of the virtue was beforehand. And certainly at the time when I was in communities and local government, it was clear that a lot of work going on already in insulation programs and double glazing programs and all sorts of home improvement programs. And I remember looking at the 80% of the standard things you'd want to do had already been done by 2009, 2008. So this is just showing a little bit about that. And then, of course, the really hard but comes later on. Now, just to show you just what happened last year, this is data from the FT. This shows the change of carbon emissions in megatons for China, US, the rest of the world, India and Europe. And the point I make on the right here is that the UK reduction last year, and it was a reduction, was undone 80 times over in the rest of the world. So it's the same in New Zealand, by the way. We say we've got to do it, we've got to do it. We've got to show people how to live. Well, at the moment, with the first and second of the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not up for that kind of learning at the moment. Now, I can see Salman Rajah in the audience. He will recognise this graph, and that is that while we've been doing all this, reducing our carbon emissions, we've also been growing our deficit in manufactured goods. And even over the last decade alone, the deficit's gone from about 7 down to 15 billion pounds a year. So what we're doing is we're importing more, and that has carbon emissions. And in fact, one of the studies that I did recently was to look back at this slide here. While all that was decreasing there, the carbon emissions were decreasing, if you add on to that the increase of the carbon emissions that come from imported goods, that line is flat at 800. So what we've got is an accounting scheme which points the finger at the Chinese who are making all the stuff that we want to use. So there was a flash recently which I thought was really interesting. In the 3 months over the summer, more electricity was generated by renewable energy than by fossil fuels. Now, that is, let me not criticise, that is a road mark, it's a step, it's a particular path on the way. But the electricity demands peaks in winter, and then they're only provided by fossil fuels and nuclear fuels, and I'll show you a graphic example of that for Germany in a minute. Electricity was only 16% of the energy use in the UK, and I'll show you another slide of that in a minute. Heat and transport fuels, the real challenge, both of those are much bigger, which you'll see in a minute, haven't even been started on, and I insert that nuclear energy is absolutely essential for a low-carbon economy. This is a fantastic slide that was given to me by the chief scientist, John Luffhead, the chief scientist at Bayes. It used to be DTI to you and I. This is showing the terawatt hours per day used in electricity, and you can see the trend there. That's the daily wiggle on top. That period that's Christmas holidays and so on. And so that's electricity. The step line going across there is the total of transport fuels for air, sea, land. And the blue line that goes up and down is our heating requirements. Now, the point about, there's a whole lot of things we can say about this slide, which is, again, another telling one. I'm just going to leap forward to find my page. The first thing is that we use twice as much energy in transport than we do as electricity. And we use about 3 times as much for heating as we do as electricity. So if we were to convert magically all of our heating and all of our transport to electrical forms, we'd need a grid which is 6 times bigger than the one we have at the moment. And we're struggling to get 50% of it to a form of renewable. We've got to go another factor longer. Now, the interesting thing about the gas one is, of course, is that that's the heating, rather. It's nearly all done by gas. And we have a fixed gas network, and it's just that the pressure and the flows are 8 times bigger in winter than in summer. Now, of course, in principle, you could do the same with electricity, but you would have to build the whole infrastructure yet again. And then, of course, the question would be, where do you get the electricity from? Now, Germany is interesting because, you know, they've spent 800 billion euros on their energy transition there. And this shows the impact of nuclear, fossil fuel, renewables, and some others, a little bit of hydro there. And again, this is for, let's have a look, that's petajoules, that'll be energy. And you can see the German energy consumption, the electricity is only 15% of all energy. I can then go on, show the next slide. And this is a rather telling slide because this is the electricity. And on this side here, we have the capacity. That is the engineering capacity. And then over there, we have the output. And the point I want to show you is that huge increase in the top of renewable capacity shows you how inefficient it is compared with the other side of how much electricity we actually get. So what we've got is something like 3 times as much in the year 2017, 3 times as much capacity as we've got energy source. Now, when we buy a coal-fired power station or a nuclear power station and it's rated at 250 or 500 megawatts, then you can run it within 80 or 90% of it all the time. These things have factors of 3s and 2s below that. Now, this is an important slide, which we haven't redrawn. I want to show you a period of 10 days from about, this is in the middle there. You can see what we've got on this brown curve is the total energy, electricity demand rather, for Germany. And you can see the daily and weekend drops and so on. And this is a period in January 2017. And you can see on this side there's quite a lot of wind. There's the tiny little flicks are the total of solar energy. The blue is the wind. And you notice here from just after January 2017 there's 10 days where there's very little energy, and most of the energy electricity is being met with fossil fuels and nuclear. The point is that there was another period just before Christmas and those 2 periods of 10 days together used in Germany as much electricity as 800 times their stored capacity. So the only way to actually power Germany at that point was with nuclear or brown coal. Any form of storage is just way off the scale. Now, I'll go over just one for the United States. If you actually look, this is a schematic of the US total energy grid, and each block is 5,000 gigawatt hours. There's the total. And if you take one block down there, the blue lot is the pump storage, and the tiny little corner there is the red, is the battery storage. So at this moment in the United States, the pump storage would run the US for 3 hours, and the battery storage would run it for 5 minutes. So that's where we are today. And so when people say we're making good progress or we're getting there, I have to correct them. Finally, China. Now, China's held out to be the place where it's all happening. But this is data, unfortunately it's from 2014, but it is recent. And this graph here shows the average total energy increase each year provided by of primary demand. And this one over here shows the wind and solar supply in 2014. That's the last of this year's. That's 14-1, and if you assume that this is growing linearly, the ratio of that decade is 28-1. That is, all of the wind and solar supply in China was producing about 3% of the electricity. And of course, here is the picture of the Chinese carbon emissions. See how it went flat there about 2015? There's a great deal of excitement, all was happening, but it's carrying on upwards. And of course, a lot of the Chinese new emissions now are actually not taking place in China, but as part of the Belt and Road project. They will carry on upwards. Now, this is a halfway point where I've talked about the scale of the problem. And here are my initial conclusions, that energy equals quality of life, and we intervene there only in the most convincing of cases. Renewables don't come anywhere near to constituting a solution to the climate change problem for an industrialized world. China is not the beacon of hope it's hoped for. And harking back to some of the other slides, there's no serious ground shift in energy sources, despite claims to the contrary. So for the rest of the lecture now, another 20 minutes, I'm going to just talk about some factors, slightly more technical engineering terms. Factors, hundreds, thousands. Now, this is a graph which has just been given to me, but I'll explain it like this. If I take a Siemens gas turbine, it weighs 312 tons and turns out 600 megawatts continuously. This translates to just under 1,920 watts per kilogram firm power from the steel. So we say, how effective is the steel used? The steel in a combined cycle gas turbine will support nearly 2,000 watts for every kilogram when it's going, and it goes for 40 years design life. Similarly, a nuclear reactor, you get similar, but you have to put a turbine next to it as well. And that combined is about 1,000. For both wind and solar, the number there is 3. 3 watts per kilogram. You can check it out. It's just very easy to do. For example, a solar installation on your roof is about 16 kilograms per square meter, and with about 40 watts per meter firm power delivered over the air, and I'm not talking here about the battery you need to deliver that firm power, you'll get 2.5 watts per kilogram per mass over a 20-year design life. So these, when it comes to materials profligacy, I think this tells a story. Now, people complain to me, but you need vast amounts of fuel, at least for the combined. But this is cheap fuel. This is not material. All of these steels, and of course the wind turbines are rich in rare earth materials and all sorts of other things, and large amounts of fiberglass and various other forms of things which are... Nobody's talked about recycling these yet. Indeed, there was a hurricane in Puerto Rico 2 years ago which shredded several square miles of solar farm. And in fact, the problem of picking up shards of silicon which are leaching other bits of material out of it is not a very pleasant job. And so it's not clear just on materials use alone that these are as good as they're made out to be. This is redrawn from a curve that the late and greatly missed David Mackay put. He had 225 megawatts of energy he wanted to provide, and he said you can do it in, and I've got the numbers here, but 15 acres for a small modular nuclear reactor, 2,400 acres for average solar cell arrays, and 60,000 acres for an average wind farm. Now, I have a different example from this. If you take the whole 4,000 square kilometres of the fenlands and convert it, which is where a lot of food for London is grown at the moment, and convert it to miscanthus, which is the most rapidly growing grass, and you cut it down around the year and store it and burn it, you can generate 2 gigawatts of electricity continuously. You say, well, that's good, but I can take 0.1 of a square kilometre, 300 metres square at Sizewell B, and produce 1.5 gigawatts continuously. So there's a ratio of 40,000 or so to 1 in the areas needed to provide the same amount of energy around the year, according to that side. And those sort of figures, when you're an engineer, figures of 1,000 matter. And I can take it even further, because here is the energy density of different fuels. How many megajoules are there in a kilogram of the air in a going past a wind turbine? It's 0.0006. In a battery, 0.01. Now that's a lead acid battery. Let me just mention that. Hydro, 0.72. Wood, 5. Petrol, hydrogen, and then down to nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. So you see these vast ratios. Now, I just want to pick out the comparison with the battery and the petrol. The ratio there of 50,000 to 1. Now, there's been a lot of work over the last 30 years on batteries, because ever since we've had portable electronics, we want better batteries. And there has been a lot of progress. And the modern lithium-ion battery is about 50 times better than the hydro. But what that means, it's still only 1,000 times less than the petrol. Now, the reason is very simple. In the case of petrol, when you burn it, every single bond, the chemical energy is given up. In a battery, all you're doing is putting 1 per 100,000 extra electron, 1 extra electron per 100,000 atoms. If you put much more in that, the material will explode. And so it's a very dilute form of storing energy. And there's nothing, all the work on the batteries now are not going to produce the extra 1,000. We may get another factor of 3 over the next 20 years, but nothing much more than that. And these are important matters for designing an engineering solution to a problem for a start. If people could get off their fix about nuclear, we could be in a much healthier position. Right. Now, this is just 2 slides to raise a question. Everybody talks about renewable energy being cheap, but I'm still not convinced, and I haven't finished this piece of work, so if anybody wants to drive a coach and horses through it in question time, they're welcome to do so. But I'm not sure that they're productive enough. And let me show you why. Here is a diagram which shows if I have a certain amount of fuel and it's the amount of energy I return, so I spend so many joules making it, and then I get some fuel. If I have 1.1 more energy in what I've dug out, then I can reuse that to build it again. But if I want to use this piece of energy I've got here for a system which educates on Earth crust, we've got to make sure it's 14 or 15 to 1. Now, the way to think about this is if a cheetah goes chasing a rabbit and it ends up consuming more of its own energy than it gets by eating the rabbit when it catches it, its long-term future is not assured. If that same animal is supporting a family, then the ratio of energy, it better not be 1 to 1, it better be 5 or 6 to 1. And so basically what it says is if we're going to have nice to have things in society, we need to make sure that the amount of energy we use to get to produce a barrel of oil is 1/14 the amount of energy in that barrel of oil. So this is the kind of thing we're doing. Now, when you look at some of the things I've been interested in is the following. We took a look, it's called energy return on energy invested. So there's a lot of data about the solar farms in Spain that were put up between 2006 to 2009. There's a wonderful book by Prieto and Hall who've done all the minutiae. And the long and short of it is, if you take the total cost of building those wind farms, and that includes, by the way, the cost of the panels is only 1/3 of the total cost, renting the farmland, connecting to the grid, maintaining the stuff over 25 years and so on and so on. It turns out that the amount of solar energy you get out is only 2.5 times, the value of the solar energy that you get out is only 2.5 times the cost of building the project in the first place. So that's how much is left over to do other parts of the economy. Similarly, Vindeby was a wind farm just off the Danish coast from 1991 to 2016. It was 1.4, but when you add in, that's just the cost of building it versus the total revenue. There's no question of maintaining. If you put the maintenance cost in there, it comes down almost to 1-to-1. So you say, well, what net have we got out of that? Hornsea, which is the new one that's going on stream next year, is about 5-to-1, because it's going to cost 3 billion to make, 1 billion to maintain. That's 4. And it's 18 billion of strike price over its life. So you get these numbers here. Yet, if I take £1 worth of coal, or £1 worth of gas, it makes 10 or 15 pounds worth of electricity. So I can see at least how we could have a modern society where the total world energy sector is only 9% of the world economy. Now, if we have to go back to, and that means that the energy return on investment of the energy sector itself is 11-to-1 in terms of economies. Now, what I'm concerned about is these numbers are rather smaller, and this means we're going to have to go back up that curve from Sweden, from where we are now with 9% to something like 25% of the total economy being the energy sector. Now, that means that some other things are going to have to give. Now, it may not be a zero-sum game, but that's something where I think the productivity of modern renewables is going to take us backwards. And after all, remember that as soon as Watt's steam engine came along, the windmills of Europe turned off within 30 years. So, because here was something more effective, reliable, movable, and so on and so forth. Right, this is a slightly short section. The challenge is megacities. It doesn't matter what you do out in the countryside romantically, but over 50% of the world population of 9 billion in the year 2000 will live in cities of 5 million or more. And of course, if you have a 34 high-rise and you put solar panels and windmills on the top, that may look after the top floor, but it has nothing to do with the other 29 underneath it. So the areal density is, and when you do the sums for the areas around Shanghai or London, and of course in case of Hong Kong and Singapore it's impossible because there are no around. It just does seem that only nuclear and fossil fuels will actually energize those cities in 2050. Even if there was a miracle today with nuclear fusion, it would take that long to control it and run it out. And CCS, that's, the carbon capture is a long way off yet. Now, this is a bit which I was involved in the start, although I only got access to the results recently. I went to the science minister and said, look, if we're going to, everybody's busy in the Department of Communities and Local Government defining what's a zero carbon house. And I said, that's fine, but look, 87% of the buildings you see outside in 2010 are going to form 70% of the building stock in 2050. We only knock a few down. For every 10 houses we build, we only knock one down. And so what we do with new houses is just at the 1% level per year. What we've got to do is retrofit all the existing buildings, 20, I keep forgetting the numbers there somewhere, 29 million New Zealand houses in the UK. So I went to Lord Drayson with the numbers, and by the way, a lot of politicians are not numerate, but he was. He took a look at this and said, we're going to have to do something. And I said, why not a pilot project? So he rang up the Technology Strategy Board, and they spent 17 million on retrofitting 100 social houses. Now, there were up to £150,000 was available per house. And there was, now, you might think that's a large number, but these were one-off projects starting from scratch. This is not a mature yellow pages sector called retrofit with a huge supply chain and thousands of competing firms doing it. This was just one-off to start, and that's a problem. Well, the cladding, treble glazing, heat pumps, all the things you do. The actual results, out of 45 particular projects which are closely targeted before and after, only 3 out of the 45 got the 80% reduction. The average was 60%, and the average cost spent on those houses was 90,000. Now, if you took those numbers and just scaled up to say linearly that if we spent that much more to get 80% reduction, we're talking about 4.3 trillion pounds to retrofit the houses, and the saving of energy is maximum about 2k per year, so it's a 75-year payback. Now, I don't know anybody who would use their own money, let alone any government would use its own money on that project. Now, of course, private lending is a 7 to 8 year program, and as soon as you scale down the money per house, then you scale down the reductions and you get to a zero gain. So the only way you would actually retrofit UK buildings on the scale, and I'm just watching the the various party manifestos at the moment, is we'd need a command economy for that kind of thing. Now, of course, one of the things I can first admit to is you may not need to do all of it that way. You may do half of the retrofit and then make sure the other half of the energy is zero carbon, and then you could meet it in a different way. But if we were to take just retrofitting houses, then that's the cost. Right, I'm now going to finish with a miscellany. History of gloom. This is one of my favourite slides. Thomas Malthus pointed out that the power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or form visit it. I'm going to leave Baron Macaulay out. I'll come back to him in a minute. William Stanley Jevons, the coal question, his point was you have to stop the Industrial Revolution because when in 200 years' time we run out of coal, the collapse of society would be too terrible to think. So let's go back to live like we did in the 18th century. And then Paul Ehrlich, still alive, later on said European society would collapse before the year 2000, by 1990, because of overpopulation. Now, the person I agree with is Baron Macaulay. On what principle is it that when we look, we see nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? That is something he said in 1830, which I think we could say today. There's bits of climate. Now, the other point I want to make here, which is the real killer, is the following, that just as Thomas Malthus was saying this, the combine harvester went into the fields, trebled the harvest, and the only starvation in Europe in the 19th century was the potato famine in Ireland, and that was political more than shortage of resources. When William Stanley Jevons was talking about it, he was looking at the known estimates of coal, and within decades, gas and oil and other coal fields around the world were discovered. And so the idea of running out by 2100 is now way off in the future. And similarly, Paul Ehrlich, just as he was writing The Population Bomb in 1970, another American, Norman Borlaug, went and trebled the harvest through his genetic revolution of wheat. So my argument is there a way out of this climate change thing? And I think the answer is yes, and here's the answer. Everywhere where people go and move into cities, the population declines. If you're in a countryside, another child is a useful pair of hands from the age of 6. If you're in a city, another child is an economic burden until they're at least 15. And so if you look at anywhere in the world, such as North America, Europe, Japan, and Australasia, where more people live in towns than in the countryside and developed countries, the absolute indigenous population, excluding immigration, is in decline. The population of Italy that we know today will be the same as Rome in the year 2100. And so here you see data that's straight out of the FT. You see, if you go back to 1970, the world average was 5 children per family. That number has now come right down. It's 2.5, and it's heading right down. The number you need to just break even is 2.1. And you can see down here the UK and China's come right down, and so on. And so what we've got is a population. So when everybody says the sea level is going to rise and 200 million people are going to lose their houses, all I'm going to say is that in the hinterlands, there'll be 200 million empty houses from the period in 1970 when we had peak population and fed them and housed them well. And this, you can see the start of that in East Germany now, where it's being depopulated. Right, getting near to the end. I just want to show you this. This is my favorite as an electronic engineer. If you go back 20 years and think of your smartphone and think of how you do without it, you would need a camera, a whole lot of letters, a transistor radio, a telephone, an alarm clock, a whole lot of newspapers, a huge picture album, and so on and so on. And all of this is here. This is probably one of the most classic cases of dematerializing the world and sustainable development. Enough of that. Now, the other problem I have is that nobody seems to talk about the upsides of more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It turns out that the vegetation has actually been increasing significantly over the period from 1982 to 2010. And so when everybody talks about burning rainforests and that, the rest of the world is greening. And the amount of green in and around Ethiopia now is striking compared with what it used to be. If the climate change imperative now, I said I wasn't going to talk about the science. The point I want to make, though, on this curve here, this is the data from diagram from John Christie given at the House of Lords recently, where he shows that, if anything, the actual increase of the temperature is about half what the models are doing. Everything I've said tonight would be true even if those curves were the other way around. That even if the heating was 4 times faster than it is now, nothing I've said tonight would change other than there was a social will to do something about it on the scale required. So my concluding thoughts are here. It seems to me we have to stay with business as usual with the stress on adaptation. Mitigation, I think, is a busted flush. Energy efficiency, well, energy efficiency has always been important. We've got to de-risk infrastructure programs on the scale that we're doing. If we suddenly find in 20 years we don't need a whole lot of what we've done, why have we done it, particularly on the scale required? And here's my question. It's a practical question to the people. If I could raise £1 trillion a year for 10 years to spend on climate change mitigation, what projects should I fund at what scale to get the best return on investment? And how would I measure that return on investment? Because nobody can answer either of those two for me at the moment. But it's even more than that. You see, if I put £1 aside for mitigating climate change, I want to know, in 1859 there was a solar electromagnetic storm, which if it happened today would take out all north-south grids and all space-based electronics. There are remnants in the magnetic fields of certain minerals that show how bad it was. There was one that missed the Earth about 5 years ago. If another one hits it now, or if we have, say, a mega volcano in Iceland that takes out European airspace for 6 months, as opposed to 1 week a few weeks ago, these are all equal. These are all things that should be fed in, and we only have a fixed bucket for how much we insure, because every money that we put aside for insurance policy is money that we're putting aside for another day and not using for our goods and betterment today. And Greenspan has a very interesting discussion about that when he compares China and Haiti in terms of earthquake codes. You know, earthquake codes in Japan are pretty tough, but then they can afford it. Whereas in Haiti, if they can't afford that yet because they've got more urgent things. And here's my last question, which as an engineer, I'm really concerned about. Who is it that owns the integrity of engineering in the United Kingdom and globally? Because all of the things I've said tonight have been about the integrity of engineering. The Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering are not speaking up at anything like the volume to heard. They're all, like the rest of us, following the runes of a 16-year-old Swedish girl. References. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.